I had worked the ironwood for 19 years before I ever saw Garrett Thorne lose an argument, and the woman who beat him did it standing on a train platform with one carpetbag and her chin up like a fence post. It was the summer the basin started to dry, and a hard summer makes a hard man harder. Thorne was already the hardest man in Calder Basin, and proud of it the way some men are proud of a scar. He owned more cattle than any 3 outfits put together, owned the best water in the valley before the rains failed, owned a house with 12 rooms that nobody laughed in. Men in Ardent Springs took off their hats when his shadow crossed them. The bank deferred to him. The marshal deferred to him. I'd seen grown ranchers go pale when his horse came up their road. They called him the cattle king, and worse behind his back, and he didn't mind either, because a man who is feared never has to be liked, and Garrett Thorne had decided a long time before I met him that being liked was a luxury for softer men. So when he came into the cookhouse one June evening, set his coffee down, and told me he'd sent off to a marriage broker in Kansas City for a wife, I near choked. "You said something to me," I asked him. "You heard it. A wife." "A wife, Hollies. A house this size ought to have one in it. The hands eat like wolves and the kitchen runs like a wreck, and there's not a woman within 30 miles I'd trust to set my table." He said it the way he'd say he meant to buy a new bull, a thing the operation lacked, a thing he would acquire. I wrote out what I want: plain woman, steady, grateful, knows her place and keeps to it. No silliness, no opinions she can't keep behind her teeth. I'll not have chatter in my house. I had known the man long enough to say what I thought, which on the ironwood was a privilege held by exactly one person, and that was me. "Garrett," I said, "you rode off for a wife the way you'd order fence wire. Women aren't fence wire." He looked at me with those flat gray eyes that had stared down lawyers and lenders, and once a Texas drover with a knife. "Everything's fence wire if you know how to string it," he said, and drank his coffee, and that was the end of the conversation as far as he was concerned. The letter that came back said the woman's name was Adeline Marsh, that she was 1820, of good character, the daughter of a schoolmaster lately deceased, and that she would arrive on the noon train the 3rd week of July. Thorne read it once, folded it into his vest, and never spoke of her again until the morning she was due, when he put on a clean shirt and had me hitch the good wagon, and we drove into Ardent Springs to collect her like she was a crate of glass off the freight. The whole town turned out, more or less. Word travels in cattle country faster than fire, and the word was that the king of Calder Basin had sent off for a meek and grateful bride, and there isn't a soul alive who can resist watching a proud man receive a delivery. They lined the boardwalk pretending to do business. The barber stood in his doorway with a razor still in his hand. I saw 2 of our own hands who were supposed to be mending the south fence loitering by the feed store with their hats pulled low, and I let it go, because I wanted to see it too. The train came in late and steaming, and the platform filled with dust and the stink of coal, and the passengers stepped down one by one: a drummer, a preacher, a family of homesteaders gray with travel, and then a woman came down the iron steps with a single carpetbag in her hand, and set it on the boards, and looked around her at the whole gawking town as though she were the one come to inspect us. She was not plain. That was the first thing, and the town drew its breath on it, because Thorne had let it be known he'd asked for plain, as if plain were safer. She wasn't a beauty out of a magazine either. She was something better and more dangerous than either. She had a clever face, the kind that's always one half-step ahead of you, and dark hair pinned up neat under a traveling bonnet that had been good once and was now carefully mended, and she wore a gray dress that had been turned and let out and turned again. A poor woman's dress, kept like a rich woman's. She had the look of someone who had come down in the world and refused to come down inside herself. Thorne stepped forward. He was a big man and he used it, and he stood over most people like weather. He stood over her too, but she didn't shrink the inch that everyone shrank. She looked up at him and waited, and when he didn't speak fast enough she spoke first. "Mr. Thorne," she said, not a question. She'd picked him out of the crowd in a glance, the clean shirt the cattle king set of his shoulders, the way the town leaned away from him. "I'm Adeline Marsh. You're taller than your letter." A couple of the loiterers snorted and tried to make it a cough. Thorne wasn't used to being talked to before he'd talked. "You'll be tired from the journey," he said, which was as near to courtesy as he came. "We'll get you to the house. There's a deal of work waiting and no sense standing in the sun." "There's a deal of work waiting," she agreed pleasantly. "But first I'd like to know whether you read my letter or only your own." The town went very quiet. "I read what the broker sent," Thorne said. "Then you read a broker," she said. "I sent 2 letters of my own to the address you gave, and I'd be obliged to know if either reached you because I set down some conditions in them, and I've come a long way on the understanding that a man who keeps his word in cattle keeps it in marriage." She picked up her carpetbag. "If you didn't get them, we can have this out now on the platform in front of everyone, or we can have it out in private like sensible people. I leave the choosing to you. But we will have it out, Mr. Thorne, before any vows, because I don't intend to learn the terms of my own life after I've signed for it. I have stood in a lot of weather in my time, and I will tell you that I never saw a man go as still as Garrett Thorne went on that platform. He'd come to collect a grateful woman who knew her place, and instead a penniless schoolmaster's daughter had just told the cattle king of Calder Basin, in front of his whole kingdom, that he would explain himself. He could have crushed her. I half expected him to. I'd seen him crush men for less. Instead, and this is the thing I have thought about every year since, instead a muscle moved in his jaw and he picked up her trunk that the porter had set down, hoisted it onto his shoulder and said, "In private then." And he turned and walked to the wagon, and she walked after him, and the whole town let its breath out at once, like a herd settling, because every soul on that boardwalk understood that they had just watched the proudest man in the territory take the first order anyone had given him in 20 years. The conditions, as it turned out, were not foolishness. She laid them out at the long table in the great cold dining room that nobody used, with me standing by the door because Thorne told me to stay. He wanted a witness, I think, the way he wanted a witness for a land deal, and it never crossed his mind that a marriage might be a different animal. Adeline sat with her hands folded and read them off a paper in a steady voice, like a teacher reading rules to a new term. She would not be a servant he happened to have married. She would run the house, and running a thing meant deciding it, not just laboring at it. She would have a household account in her own name, money she could spend without asking, because a woman who must beg for every nickel is not a wife but a dependent, and she'd buried one of those, her mother, worn out begging her father for the price of flour while he bought books they couldn't afford. She would not be struck, not ever, not in anger nor in drink nor in correction, and if she ever feared it she would take the household money and go, and he would not stop her. And this was the one that made him set his coffee down. She would not share his bed until they were neither of them strangers. "I'll keep your house and your name from the first day," she said. "The rest is not a thing you order off a broker. The rest you earn, the same as I'll earn your trust. I won't be bought into it and I won't be cold about it. But it comes when it comes freely, or it doesn't come at all." I waited for the storm. Thorne sat a long moment. Then he said, in a voice I'd never heard him use, low and a little baffled, "You came all this way to a man you'd never met to tell him what he can't do in his own house." "I came all this way," she said, "because my father died owing more than he ever taught, and the bank took the schoolhouse and the cottage and his books and my mother's spoons. And there was nothing left for an unmarried woman of 18-20 but to be somebody's poor relation or somebody's wife. I chose wife, because at least a wife has a position, if she has the sense to define it before she signs. I'm not here because I'm helpless, Mr. Thorne. I'm here because I looked at every road open to a woman in my circumstance, and I judged this one the road with the most road left in it. That's not the same as helpless. Don't make the mistake of thinking it is." He looked at her for a long while. Then he looked at me, and I had the sense, I will never forget it, that for the first time in all our years he wanted to know what I thought and couldn't ask. "Agreed," he said at last to her, not to me. "All of it." "All of it," she repeated to be sure. "I said all of it. I don't say things twice." "You'll find I make people say things twice," Adeline Marsh told him, and there was the smallest crook at the corner of her mouth, the first crack of warmth in her, but only the things worth hearing again. And she stood and asked me, not him, where the kitchen was, because if she was to run a house she'd best learn where it kept its troubles. They were married 4 days later in the front room by a circuit preacher, with the hands lined up scrubbed and uneasy along the wall and me standing as the nearest thing Thorne had to a friend. She wore the gray dress, turned once more, with a sprig of yellow rabbit brush pinned at the collar that she'd picked herself on the walk up from the creek. He wore his church coat. When the preacher asked was there anything either party wished to say, Thorne said no, and Adeline looked at him and said, "Only that I'll hold to my half. See you hold to yours." And the hands all studied their boots, and I had to turn a laugh into a cough, and that was the wedding of the King of Calder Basin. She took the house apart inside a week, and not gently. I don't mean she threw anything out. She was too poor in her bones to waste so much as a bent nail. I mean she found the rot in how the place ran and dug it out. The Ironwood had a Chinese cook named Sam Liu who was a good man treated like a mule, and 2 girls from town who came up days to scrub, and they had all been working at cross purposes for years because nobody had ever told them what the house was for. Adeline told them. She drew up a plan for the kitchen and the laundry and the larder. She went through the account books that Thorne kept locked, the household ones, and found that the man had been robbed blind for years by a supply agent in Ardent Springs who'd been adding 1/3 to every invoice on the gamble, a good gamble, that the great Mr. Thorne was too proud to check sums on flour and lamp oil. She found it in 3 days. Thorne had not found it in 3 years. I was there when she brought it to him, the doctored invoices spread on his desk with her own neat columns beside them in pencil. I expected him to be glad. Instead, he went dark in the face, and I understood, it took me a moment, that what stung wasn't the money. It was that she'd seen a thing he'd missed, and seen it fast, and that the seeing made plain a truth he'd built a whole life to hide. That being feared is not the same as being shrewd, and that a man can be the most powerful figure in a valley and still be played for a fool by a clerk because no one dares correct him. "I'll deal with Pickett," he said, short, meaning the supply agent. "You'll deal with him by riding in and frightening him," Adeline said, "and he'll pay you back what's plain on these pages and go right on cheating every smaller account in the basin who hasn't got a wife to check his sums. Or," she let the word sit, "or you take these to the bank and the other ranchers, and you let it be known quiet what Pickett's been doing, and the small outfits move their trade, and Pickett either reforms or goes broke, and you've done more good with a stack of paper than you'd do with a whole afternoon of looming over a frightened little man. Frightening Pickett feeds your temper. Ruining his trade feeds the basin. They're not the same thing, and the basin doesn't run on your temper, however much it thinks it does." Thorne stared at her. Then he got up and went out and saddled his horse and rode off and didn't come back till dark, and I figured she'd finally pushed him a step too far. But the next week the small ranchers all moved their trade, quiet, and Pickett's prices came down for everyone, and Thorne never said one word about it to her or to me. And that was how I learned that the man could be moved, not driven, never driven, but moved. If you set the thing in front of him so that doing right and doing well lay along the same line. She had a gift for that. It was the most useful gift I ever saw in a person. She never once told Garrett Thorne to be a better man. She just kept arranging the world so that the better thing and the smarter thing turned out, again and again, to be the same thing, until being better got to be a habit he mistook for being shrewd. The hands took to her before he did, and they took to her hard. It started with Tobe Akers's boy. Tobe was one of our oldest hands, a bow-legged little man who'd ridden for the Ironwood since before me, and his wife had died and left him a son, 8 years old, who lived in the bunkhouse and ran half wild because there was nobody to do otherwise with him. The boy, his name was Wesley, broke his arm coming off a half-broke pony that summer, a bad break, and Tobe was sick with worry and useless with the doctoring, and it was Adeline who sat up in the kitchen with the boy and the doctor from town, and held the child's good hand, and talked him steady through the splinting in a low, even voice, the schoolteacher's voice, and afterward kept him up at the house in a real bed while it knit, and read to him in the evenings. She read to him out of the few books she'd managed to keep when the bank took the rest. And one evening I came up to the house on some errand and stopped outside the lit window because I heard two voices reading, the boy's halting and the woman's patient, and a third presence in the room, silent. Garrett Thorne stood in the doorway of the parlor with his shoulder against the frame, in the dark, watching his wife teach a hired man's son his letters, and on the face of the hardest man in Calder Basin there was an expression I had no name for because I had never seen it there before. It was hunger, not for her or not only for her, for the room, for the warm lit ordinary room with a child in it and a voice reading and the lamp making everything gold. He stood in the dark and looked at the light like a man outside his own house, which in every way that mattered he was. I went away without my errand. Some things a man shouldn't be caught watching. The trouble came up out of the ground, the way real trouble does. It came up as no trouble at all, which is how the bad kind always starts. The creeks were low that year and getting lower. Calder Basin was good country, but it lived and died on water, and the water came down out of the high ground through a string of springs and creeks that no one had ever had to think hard about because there had always been enough. That summer there wasn't enough, and a man named Royce Sutton had bought up the old Vance place at the head of the basin where the best of the springs rose, and Royce Sutton was a smiling man. I distrust a smiling man in a dry year. Sutton came down to Ardent Springs in a fine buggy and bought rounds at the saloon and shook every hand, and what he was buying with the rounds, and the handshakes was the right to be liked while he did a thing nobody likes. Because Sutton owned the high ground now, and he'd quietly bought the paper on 3 of the small homesteads at the foot of the basin, the families who farmed the bottoms, the Ray's family, old Hessler the German, the widow Cobb and her boys, and he had a lawyer and a notion. The notion was that water rights in the territory went a first use and could be claimed and held, and that a man who owned the head of the basin and the paper on the foot could, with the right filings, end up owning the use of every drop in between. He wasn't going to steal the basin. He was going to file it away from everyone in it, legal as a deed, with a smile, in a dry year when nobody had the cash or the lawyer to fight him. The first Thorne knew of it, Sutton came up to the ironwood himself to make a neighborly offer. He sat in our parlor and smiled and proposed that he and Thorne, the 2 big men of the basin, divide the water between them and let the small fry sort themselves out. 2 kings, he said, are better than a mob. Thorne, I am sorry to say, near went for it, not out of greed, out of pride. Sutton had flattered the right wound. He treated Thorne as the other great power, the natural partner. The man too big to be lumped in with widows and homesteaders, and Thorne's pride rose to that bait like a trout to a fly. It was Adeline who slid the hook out. She'd been sitting in the corner with her mending, quiet, the way she could be quiet in a way that made men forget she was listening, and when Sutton had gone, bowing over her hand, calling her ma'am in that buttered voice, she set down the mending and said, "He doesn't want a partner." "He offered partnership," Thorne said. "He offered you a partnership in robbing your own neighbors because if you're in it you can't fight it, and you're the only man in the basin big enough to fight it. He doesn't want your help, Garrett. He wants your silence, and he's willing to pay for it in flattery, because he's smart enough to know flattery is the only coin you've never learned to count." She folded her hands. "The day after you shake on it, the Ray's family and the Hesslers and the Cobbs lose their water, and they lose it with the king of Calder Basin standing on the high ground beside the man who took it. And the basin will hate you, and it will be right to, and 10 years from now you'll be richer, and you'll have a name that fathers use to frighten children. Is that the name you want carved up over the gate?" I watched it land. I watched Garrett Thorne, who had been about to make the worst bargain of his life because a smiling man had called him great, sit very still while his wife took his pride in both hands and turned it gently to point at something better. "They're not my people," he said, but he said it weak. "They're your basin," she said, "and a king with no people is just a man with a lot of grass." He didn't answer her that night, but he didn't ride up to shake Sutton's hand either, and the next morning he sent me down to the Bottoms to find out, quiet, exactly what paper Sutton held and on whom, and I knew the fight was joined, even if he hadn't admitted yet which side he was fighting on. What broke him open was the boy. It always is with proud men. They'll guard their own hearts behind a wall a mile thick, and then a child gets in under the gate. Wesley's arm had knit and he was up at the house most evenings now, by long custom, doing his letters at the kitchen table while Adeline ran the household around him. One evening in the worst of the heat, with the creeks down to a trickle and tempers all over the basin gone short, the boy asked her a question I happened to hear, because I was on the back porch mending tack in the last of the light. "Miss Thorne," he said, "is Mr. Thorne your husband or your boss?" And Adeline, without missing a stitch, said, "That's a sharp question, Wesley. Why do you ask it?" "Because Pa says he's your boss. Pa says nobody's anybody's husband out here. There's just whoever's the boss and whoever ain't, and the women is mostly whoever ain't." There was a silence, and in the silence I heard, from inside the dark dining room where I hadn't known anyone was, the scrape of a chair. Thorne had been sitting in there alone, in the dark, the way he'd taken to doing, sitting near the warm rooms without entering them, like a dog that's been kicked out of the house too many times to come in even when the door's left open. Adeline knew he was there. I think she'd known the whole time. She answered the boy, but she answered him for two. "Your pa's wrong," she said, "though he's wrong the way most folks are wrong because he's only ever seen the bad kind. A boss tells you what to do and you do it because you're afraid not to. A husband, a real one, a good one, tells you what he's afraid of, and you tell him what you're afraid of, and then neither of you has to be afraid alone anymore. That's the difference, Wesley. A boss makes you smaller so he can feel big. A husband would rather be smaller himself than see you shrink. Most men out here are bosses because being a husband takes more courage and they haven't got it, but some do." And she let that sit a moment in the lamplight with the dark dining room listening. "Some do," she said again, softer. And then plain the way she said everything, "Now do your sevens." The boy did his sevens, and after a while the dining room door opened and Garrett Thorne came out into the kitchen light, and he didn't say anything. He just stood there a moment looking at the two of them at the table, and then he pulled out a chair and sat down across from the boy and said, gruff, "You're carrying your one wrong. Look, 6 times 7. And he showed him. The cattle king of Calder Basin, who could be cheated on flour invoices because he was too proud to do small sums, sat at a kitchen table in the heat and taught a hired man's son his multiplication, and I sat out on the porch with a bridle in my hands and didn't move for fear of breaking it. That was the night the walls started down, not all at once. Walls that thick don't come down all at once, but that was the night the first stone came loose, and after that one there was no putting it back. He told her about his brother in August. I had it from her much later, when she and I had got to be old friends in the way that the two people who love a difficult man best will get to be friends, conspirators in his happiness. But I'd seen the outside of it. I'd seen the two of them up on the rise behind the house one evening, sitting on the old bench by the single grave that was up there, the grave I'd never once seen Thorne visit in all my years. It was his brother's. Younger brother, name of Davy, dead at 19, the year before I came to the Ironwood, and Thorne had built the whole empire after that and never spoken the name, and the hands who'd been there before me told it in whispers. That the two boys had come up from nothing together, that they'd had a hard father and a worse winter, and that Davy had died of a fever in a line shack in a storm because Garrett, riding for the doctor, had been turned back twice by the same blizzard and got there a day too late, and had knelt in the snow and sworn, with his brother dead in his arms, that he would never again be small enough to be turned back by anything. Not weather, not men, not God. He would be so big and so hard that the world could never again take from him, a thing he meant to keep. That was the engine of him. That was the whole of the cattle king, laid bare. A boy in a snowstorm who decided that the cure for grief was power, and spent 30 years proving himself wrong without ever once admitting the experiment had failed. He told Adeline all of it on the bench by the grave in August, and she didn't say a wise thing or a soft thing. She told me later she just took his hand and held it, and after a while she said the only thing that could have reached him, which was, "You didn't fail, Davy. The snow did. You've spent 30 years punishing yourself for the weather." And the king of Calder Basin put his face in his free hand, and his shoulders went, and his wife held his other hand and led him up on the rise, where no one could see but the one grave and the dark, and a fool foreman who happened to be bringing the horses up and stopped 100 yards off and turned them quietly around. I want to be plain about what was happening, because it is the heart of the whole thing. They had not yet so much as kissed. She'd held to her condition and he'd held to his word, and the marriage was still, by the letter, an arrangement. But somewhere in those weeks, the arrangement had quietly become the truest thing either of them had. She had not gentled him by yielding. She gentled him by standing, by being a wall of her own that his wall could finally lean against without either of them falling. He'd married a woman to run his house, and instead he'd found the one person in the world who was not afraid of him and did not want anything from him that he could simply hand over. And a man like that, a man who has only ever been able to buy or frighten his way to what he wanted, will fall in love with the one soul who can't be bought or frightened the way deep water falls down a hill, all at once, and forever, and without making a sound. The Sutton business came to its head at the worst of the drought, in September, with the creeks down to mud, and the whole basin's nerves stretched like fence wire. Sutton made his move. He filed, the lawyer in town had the papers, a claim on the High Springs as first and continuous user, and notices went out to the bottom homesteads that the water crossing Ironwood and Vance land was spoken for, and the Ray's family and old Hessler and the widow Cobb got letters telling them in lawyers' language that their crops would die by law. There was a meeting at the church in Ardent Springs, all the small outfits and the worried townsfolk, and it was an ugly, frightened meeting. The kind where men start talking about rifles because they can't see any other tool. 2 of the younger Ray's boys and one of Hessler's were for riding up to the Vance place and burning Sutton out, and it would have happened. In a dry September, with families looking at ruin, it would have happened, and there'd have been killing, and Sutton, this was the devil of it, Sutton would have won even by losing, because the law hangs men who burn out a lawful claimant, and a smiling man with the right paper can afford to let his enemies destroy themselves. It was Adeline who stopped it, and she stopped it by sending for me. She couldn't go to that meeting herself. A woman, the cattle king's wife, walking into a roomful of frightened armed men would have done no good and might have done harm. So she sent me, with a plan worked out on paper, the way she worked everything, and she sent something better than a plan. She sent the one thing that could change the arithmetic of that room. She sent Thorne's water. Here is what she had figured, sitting at the kitchen table with the maps and the old survey filings she'd had me dig out of the county office. Sutton's whole claim rested on the High Springs being first and continuous use, but the Ironwood held older paper. Thorne's own outfit, and the Vance place before Sutton bought it, had been drawing from those springs since before the territory kept proper records, and Thorne, proud, careless, never thinking he'd need it, had let the formal filings lapse for years because who was going to challenge the king of Calder Basin over water? Nobody, except a smiling man who'd done his reading. Sutton had filed into the gap that Thorne's pride had left open. The strongest man in the basin had nearly lost the basin's water because he'd been too big to bother with the paper, exactly the way he'd nearly lost his money to a clerk for the same reason. And this was Adeline's hook, the place where doing right and doing well lay along the same line. The old records, the ones she dug out, showed that the springs had been used in common time out of mind by all the outfits in the basin, big and small together. There was a basis in the oldest filings for a shared right, not Thorne's water, not Sutton's. The basin's water held in common with a board of users to manage it in dry years. If Thorne would stand up and join his old paper to the small outfit's old paper, the common claim would be older and stronger than Sutton's lonesome smiling grab, and the courts would have to honor it, and Sutton's whole game would come apart, not in blood, but in a courthouse, where a smiling man with a clever lawyer can be beaten by an older deed and a united basin, and there's not a thing he can do but smile his way back to wherever he came from. The catch, the only catch, and it was the whole catch, was that Garrett Thorne would have to walk into that frightened church and stand up in front of the homesteaders and the widows he'd spent 20 years looking down on and ask to be one of them. Not their king, their neighbor. He'd have to fold his great water in with the widow Cobb's little water and let a board of small men vote on it alongside him. He'd have to make himself, after 30 years of swearing he never would again, small. Adeline didn't make him do it. I want that understood. She never once made him do anything. She laid it on the table, the maps and the old paper and the plan, and she said to him, "I was there for this in the kitchen, the lamp lit against the dusk," she said. "I can send Hollies with the plan, and it might work even with you staying up here being the king on your hill. But it'll work surer if you go yourself, and it'll mean something it can't mean any other way. They'll fold their water in with a board if the board's just small men frightened together. But if the biggest man in the basin walks in and lays his great paper down first and says, 'Count me as one of you, Garrett,' that's a thing those people will tell their grandchildren. That's the day the king got down off the hill." She looked at him steady. "I won't tell you to go. You've spent 30 years on that hill and you built it stone by stone and it's yours to come down from or not. But I'll tell you what I see. I see a man who decided in a snowstorm at 19 that being big was the same as being safe, and it's made him rich and it's made him feared and it's left him sitting alone in a dark room next to a warm one. The hill never once made you safe, Garrett. It just made you lonely with a view. You can come down. The door's open. It's been open the whole time." He sat there a long while. Outside the window the basin was going gold and then gray, all that good dry grass, all that grass and not enough water, all that kingdom. Then he stood up, and he put on his church coat, not his looming coat, the church one, and he gathered up the maps. And he said to me, "Saddle 2, Hollies." And to her he said nothing at all, but he stopped in the doorway and looked back at her. And whatever passed between them in that look was a thing I had no business seeing and have never forgotten. And then we rode down to Ardent Springs in the dark to the worst meeting in the history of Calder Basin, and Garrett Thorne got down off his hill. I will tell you about that church as long as I live. It was packed and hot and frightened, lamps smoking, the Ray's boys with their jaws set, and a rifle leaned in the corner that everyone could see and no one would name. Old Hessler red in the face, the widow Cobb white in hers with her 2 half-grown sons beside her, the whole bottom of the basin looking down the barrel of a dry winter and a lawyer's letter. And the talk was all of riding up to burn Sutton out, and it was getting away from the men who knew better, the way frightened talk does. And then the door opened and Garrett Thorne walked in, and the whole church went silent and turned, because the king had come, and nobody knew whose side the king was on. And in that room full of people who'd lose everything, the king's side was the only thing that mattered, and not one of them dared hope it was theirs. He walked up the middle. He was a head taller than any man there, and he used it for the last time in his life, used it to get to the front, where they had to look at him. And then he did the thing none of them had ever seen and none of them ever forgot. He took off his hat. Garrett Thorne took off his hat in front of the widow Cobb and the Ray's family and old Hessler the German, the small folk, the whoever ain't, and he held it in his 2 hands the way a smaller man holds his hat before a bigger one, and he said, and his voice wasn't the king's voice, it was lower and it cost him. You could hear what it cost him, he said. "I've been a poor neighbor to this basin. I won't stand here and pretend otherwise. You all know it, and so do I. I've looked down on most of you most of my life, and the man up the hill, he meant Sutton, knew it, and he's counting on it. He's counting on me staying up on my own hill so the rest of you can be picked off one family at a time. Well, he set a roll of papers down on the table at the front. These are the Ironwood's old water filings, older than anything Sutton's got. They're worth more than any man's claim in this room, and I'm laying them in with yours. Not over yours, in with yours. There's an old basis, my wife found it in the county records, where I was too proud to look, for the springs to be held in common by all of us, big and small, with a board to share them out in dry years, and every outfit one vote, mine the same as the widow Cobb's. I'm asking this basin to make that claim together today and file it tomorrow, and let the courts and not the rifles answer Mr. Sutton. My paper's the oldest. Yours is the most. Put them together and there's not a lawyer alive can break it. Keep them apart and he takes us one at a time. He stopped. The church was dead silent. I'm asking, he said, and the word came hard out of him, the hardest word in his whole life, to be counted as one of you. That's all. One vote, one neighbor. I should have offered it 20 years ago. He turned the hat in his hands. I'd be obliged. I've been in rooms when news of a death came, and rooms when a baby came, and a room once when a man was acquitted who everyone thought would hang, and I have never been in a room that turned the way that church turned. Because they had all come ready to die for their water, ready to ride up a hill and burn a man and be hanged for it, frightened and small and alone. And the biggest man in the world had just walked in, taken off his hat, and made them not small and not alone. The widow Cobb was the first to speak, and all she said was, "All right then," in a voice like she'd set down something heavy. And old Hessler said something in German, and then in English said, "Ja, yes," together. And the Ray's boy who'd had the hottest blood went over to the corner and quietly stood the rifle on its butt and set his hat on the muzzle, which everyone saw, and that was the war over before it started. They drew it up that night. The Calder Basin Water Commons, one outfit, one vote, the king's name on the same line as the widow's, and they filed it in the county seat inside the week. And Sutton's lawyer looked at the old paper and the United Basin, and did the arithmetic a smiling man can always do faster than a brave one. And Sutton sold the Vance place by November and smiled his way out of the territory, beaten by an older deed and a man who got down off his hill without a single shot. Exactly as Adeline had drawn it on the kitchen table by lamplight. The cruelty of it, the cold, smiling, legal cruelty, was answered not by blood but by paper and by neighbors, and that is the only kind of victory in this life that doesn't curdle. He didn't go straight home that night. We rode out of Ardent Springs in the dark, and at the fork where the road splits for the Ironwood, Thorne pulled up and sat his horse a minute looking at nothing. "Hollies," he said. "Garrett, how long have I been a fool?" "'Bout as long as I've known you," I said, because he'd have known I was lying if I'd said otherwise, and a true thing was the only gift worth giving him just then. He huffed something that was almost a laugh, the first one I'd heard out of him in years. "She found the paper," he said, "in the county records, the thing that saved the whole basin. She found it in an afternoon, in records I owned the right to look at any day of 20 years and never did because I figured I was too big to need to." He shook his head slow. "I sent off for a woman to keep my house quiet, and she's the only soul ever walked onto my land who could have saved it." He looked over at me in the dark. "What kind of man," he said, and his voice had gone strange, "spends his whole life building a wall so high that the one person who could have helped him near can't get over it?" "A scared one," I said, "same as the rest of us. You just had more money to build the wall with." He sat with that. Then he turned his horse toward home and we rode, and after a while he said, quiet, almost to himself, "I don't want her to stay because of the bargain." "Then tell her so," I said. "That's the whole trouble," said the cattle king of Calder Basin. "I've never in my life had to ask for a thing I wanted. I've only ever taken it or bought it or made men too afraid to keep it from me. I don't know how a man asks." He was quiet a moment. I don't know how to want a thing I can't make happen. You ask the same as anybody, I told him. You stand there with your hat in your hands and you say the true thing and you let her do what she wants with it. You did it tonight in that church in front of the whole basin. You can do it once more in your own kitchen, for the one that matters most. He didn't answer, but I saw him reach up in the dark and touch the brim of his hat, like a man checking he still knew how to take it off. What he did the next evening, and he did it right, and I had it from her after, every word, because she was so full of it she had to tell someone, and I was the one she'd made her friend. He found her in the kitchen at the end of the day, the lamp lit, Wesley gone back to the bunkhouse, the house quiet. And he didn't loom and he didn't command. He took off his hat in his own kitchen to his own wife, and he held it in his 2 hands, and Adeline said she knew the moment she saw the hat come off that the world had turned over, because the hat coming off was the whole man surrendering, and she set down what she was holding and waited. Our bargain, he said, the terms you set on the train. I remember them, she said, steady, but her heart, she told me, was going like a colt. You said the rest comes free or it doesn't come. You said you'd not be bought into it and you'd not be cold about it, and it'd come when it came, freely or not at all. He turned the hat. I'm releasing you from the whole of it, the bargain, all of it. If you want to go, there's money in your name, your own, more than enough, and the wagon's yours and a hand to drive you to the train, and I'll not say one word to stop you, and I'll see you never want for anything as long as you live. You owe me nothing. You came here in a hard season because the world left you no better road, and you've more than paid your way. You saved this whole basin, and you made this house a home, and you taught me my own multiplication. God help me, and you owe me nothing, and you're free to go. He stopped. His voice had gone rough. That's the first half of what I came to say, and I had to say it first, so you'd know the second half's got no bargain under it. Adeline said she could hardly breathe, and the second half. And Garrett Thorne, who had never asked for a thing in his life, stood in his kitchen with his hat in his hands and asked. I'd have you stay, he said. Not as a bargain. Not to run the house. Sam Lou can run the house. I'll teach the man to run the whole territory if it'll keep you. I'd have you stay because you're the only soul ever made me less afraid, and I've been afraid my whole life and called it being strong, and I'm tired, Adeline. I'm tired of the hill. I built it so the snow could never take anything from me again, and all it ever did was keep the warm rooms on the other side of a wall. You got over the wall. I don't know how you did it, but you're on the inside now, and I find I can't go back to the dark room next to the warm one. Not now I know what's in the warm one. He swallowed. I love you. That's the plain truth, and I've no skill at saying it, and I'll likely never say it well, but I'll say it true every day you'll let me. Stay because you choose to, or go because you choose to. But I'll not have you stay one more hour because of any bargain, because I want, and his voice broke on it, the king's voice, clean in two, I want to be chosen, once, by somebody who could leave. I've had a whole life of people who couldn't. I'd trade the whole of it for one who could and didn't. And Adeline Marsh, who had stepped off the noon train with one carpetbag and beaten the proudest man in the territory on his own platform, crossed her own kitchen, and took the hat out of his hands and set it on the table, and put her 2 hands on either side of the hard, scared face of the cattle king of Calder Basin, and said, You great fool! I chose you the day I held to my conditions on this very table, because a man who'd agree to all of them was a man worth the staying. I've been choosing you a little more every day since, in a house you didn't even know I'd already moved into for good. I'm not going anywhere, I never was. I was only ever waiting for you to ask me instead of order me. And she smiled, the full smile, the one she'd kept crooked and held back all those weeks, and she said, Welcome home, Garrett. You've been standing in your own doorway long enough. I'll draw the curtain there, the way she'd want me to, the way the man himself would want. Because what's between 2 people who have crossed that long a distance to each other is theirs and no one else's. I'll only say the lamp burned late in that kitchen, and that the dark dining room where a hard man used to sit alone next to the warmth was never sat in alone again. I'm an old man now, and the ironwood's run by younger hands, and I sit most evenings on the porch of the little house they built me down by the creek that still runs, even in dry years, because the Calder Basin Water Common sees to it. One outfit, one vote, the way she drew it up on a kitchen table 50 years gone. The widow Cobb's grandsons run her old place. One of the Ray's girls is the school teacher in Ardent Springs now, in a school that Garrett Thorne paid to build and never once let anyone put his name on, because his wife told him a man who needs his name on a school never understood what a school was for. They had near 40 years. They had 3 of their own, and they raised up Tobe Akers's boy Wesley near as another, and Wesley grew to be the foreman after me, a good one, gentle and shrewd, taught his letters and his loyalty at the same kitchen table. The hill came down so far that by the end you'd never have known the man had ever been a king at all. He got to be just Garrett, old Garrett Thorne, who'd give you the shirt off his back and argue you blind about the price of feed, and lose every argument he ever had with his wife and grin about it. The fear went out of his name, the way water goes into dry ground, slow, and then all at once it's green. She went first, in her sleep, an old woman, with him holding her hand the way she'd held his on the bench by the grave that first August, and he didn't last the year after, which surprised no one, least of all me. A man can live a long time on a hill alone behind a wall, but once he's been led into the warm room, he can't go back to the cold one, not even to wait. They're up on the rise together now, the 3 graves, Davy, and then the 2 of them beside him, the brother the boy couldn't save and the woman who saved the man. I go up there sometimes, slow, on a stick, and I stand and I think about a platform on a hot July day, and a poor woman with one carpetbag and her chin up, telling the king of Calder Basin that they would have it out before any vows because she'd not learned the terms of her own life after she'd signed for it. And I think, that was the day the whole basin turned, and not one soul standing on that boardwalk knew it. They thought they were watching a proud man take delivery of a quiet wife. What they were watching was a man being saved, and too proud yet to know it, by the only person on God's earth who was never once afraid of him, and who loved him anyway, and best of all, on purpose, with her eyes wide open, having seen the whole hard truth of him and chosen it free. That's the story of how Garrett Thorne got down off his hill. I was there for the most of it. And if you ask me what I learned in 19 years of working for the hardest man in the territory and 40 of watching him be gentled, I'll tell you the one thing she taught us all, the schoolmaster's daughter, without ever once saying it as a lesson. That being feared is the loneliest kind of safe there is, and that the bravest thing a strong man ever does is take off his hat and hold it in his 2 hands and ask,